David is a physician from Canada. He's a hospitalist, which means he works in the hospital. Tremendous experience with COVID. And I think you're going to love to hear what he has to say, his experience in Canada, which kind of mirrors the United States. There's a lot of misinformation and penalties for us to say anything against the narrative. So, David, welcome.
Well, yeah, thanks very much. It's great being here, great being in this environment of like-minded people.
So you're coming down here eventually to establish your practice here in the United States?
Yes, I have a wellness program that I am so passionate about that I've just developed over the last 3 years, and yeah, that's coming in.
So why don't you tell us about your experience with COVID treatment in Canada, what you could do, what you think you should be doing, and what you actually did for those patients?
Yes, well, so I found myself, flashback to March of 2020, when all there was really at that time for everybody in the world was fear. There wasn't enough information that we could sort of debunk or figure out what was coming at us so quickly. And all of a sudden, I was called a frontline worker. I was never called that before, but there I was. And I thought to myself, in this environment, I had to keep going. I had to keep working. Some of my colleagues decided that the risk was not for them, and they decided to do other things. But it's a small community hospital, and I just couldn't leave the community that I had served for 17 years. So I decided to, for lack of a better word, bulletproof my own immune system as best I knew how.
So what would you say to the foundation to bulletproof your immune system? What's the number one thing you should do?
Well, I have to say it echoes probably what you said 10,000 times. Don't run your body on sugar or carbohydrates.
Carbohydrate, sugar. So there's, in my book, Sugar Crush, I talk about a chemical that I learned from Dr. Cook at Stanford 15 years ago. And it's called asymmetric dimethylarginine. Big word, but what it means is it blocks the nitric oxide pathway. Then the O2 levels start to go down. And there are papers that state the higher your ADMA levels, asymmetric dimethylarginine, the higher the mortality rate. So if you go to the hospital, they're going to give you sugar, IV, and they're going to put you on a ventilator. COVID deaths were not caused by lack of inspiration and expiration for the lungs. They were based on the fact that you couldn't exchange oxygen. And they're jumping on your chest while you can't breathe. Of course you're going to die. So the question is, why would that narrative have been pushed forward? And the second narrative, vaccines, and the PCR testing that we just talked about. So let's start with the PCR testing. What is it, why it's not effective, and it's not a good metric for the SARS virus?
Yeah, so I only really go back to the inventor of the PCR test, Dr. Mullis, who is no longer with us, but had some interviews in 2018 and 2019 where he describes what his intention for the PCR test was. And it is a magnifier, but a magnifier on, I guess for lack of a better word, quantum scale. So he gave an analogy in one of his videos I think is really, really useful. He said this test is so powerful that it can take a grain of sand but make it seem like it's the size of Mount Everest depending on how many cycles you put this through. So think about that. So if you have a portion of any entity, called even a virus, even if it's a portion of that virus, you can amplify it to the 10th degree. It's staggering, and call it something that it's not. You would never call a grain of sand Mount Everest, would you?
So that test is what our metrics are, gauging how many people had, quote unquote, the SARS virus. So I use analysis. There's, I'm sure, lint on this floor. And I ask any one of you to walk around and find that. You made one pass, you don't see any. I say keep walking around till you find it. And the revolutions going around and around were changed, by the way, 2 days after Biden took office. Instead of walking around looking 40 times, they reduced it to 20 times, which means the curve bent down. They really didn't have SARS-CoV disease. They just had lint, as I say, on their body. So they were classified as COVID. And they were put on ventilators. And that is obviously a very bad thing to do, in my opinion. But if you say that publicly, then your narrative is against what the government is saying. And you can lose your license, practice medicine, if you go against the narrative. So what we're doing here is kind of dangerous, but I think we have to stand up and take control. So that's the first part, the measurement of that. So how did you treat these patients with COVID?
Well, there were pre-printed orders. So this was a consensus that the powers that be decided. The health authorities are divided into different segments encompassing various amounts of hospitals. So I was in one of them, and they just had their bureaucracy, essentially, dictate the pre-printed orders. And they changed quite a lot. But of course, it was very, very far-reaching medication that really didn't address endothelial dysfunction, which is one of the big things that was going on with this disease. Didn't really address, at least not in the beginning, the hypercoagulable state, the thrombosis that would occur in this disease. Was really, really only infectious and oxygenation-based protocols, at least in the beginning. And, weren't really seeing a whole lot of movement with those treatments.
Right. So what he's saying is diffusion of oxygen across the membrane. And asymmetric dimethylarginine is that chemical that blocks that. I learned that 15 years ago with Dr. Cook at Stanford. It's in my book on page 25. Now, how come I know that? I'm a podiatrist by training. I was looking at it from a peripheral nerve problem, but it applies to a lung tissue as well. So why is this narrative not being addressed in not only Canada, but the United States? I was just talking to somebody from Siberia the other day, who used to live in Canada, by the way. And we were talking about the war and this, that, and the other thing.
Same temperature, anyhow.
And he said there's more freedom in Russia than there is in Canada. That's a shocking statement. We've lost not only our immunity, we've lost our liberty to these outrageous bureaucratic decisions. I think it's purposeful. I don't think it's just happenstance. So my basis is that diet is the problem. What's in our diet, which is carbohydrates, but it's not normal carbohydrates. 80% of the food in the United States has high fructose corn syrup in it. 80%. 98% of all the meat we eat is fed corn. Cows don't eat corn. But if that's the only thing for dinner, that's what they get. They produce inflammatory cytokines, omega-6 fatty acids. When cows eat grass, they produce omega-3 fatty acid. It sounds like, why would 3 carbons over be such a big difference? But it is. It causes that inflammation on the endothelium. The word he uses, endothelium, means the lining of the blood vessel. And Dr. Cook, who I learned this from, this is the first question I asked him in 2005. I said, Dr. Cook, could you walk me through this cholesterol hypothesis? I had my opinion, but I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of the world's leading cardiologist at Stanford, who also has a PhD in vascular biology. So I asked him, I said, I don't understand that. And he said, well, where do you hear the answer? He said the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessel, is like Teflon. It's smooth. When you eat sugar, it makes it like Velcro. These are his words. And the signaling molecule is cholesterol, which is produced in your liver. So it gets that signal and goes to the area of inflammation and seals it off. That's why that's called plaque. The real name is atherosclerosis. So I did a deep dive on that word back to 1863, Virchow, famous physiologist, and he did the same thing. He opened up an artery. He said, what is this gunk? The word he used. And gunk in Greek is athero. And hardened gunk is atherosclerosis. That's not a disease. That's an effect in Greek to describe what you just saw in English. And I think that's another fundamental problem with medicine. We describe the effect in a different language as if that was cause. It's not cause. The cause, he actually said that in 1863, inflammation. He didn't know it was sugar, but it is sugar. It's that simple. So then we have to ask the question, why is everybody taking a statin drug? Cholesterol is not causing heart disease, sugar is. So we have the FDA in this country, Food and Drug Administration. Well, why is the food portion? It's a poison. High fructose corn syrup is a poison. And it causes, in my opinion, every neurodegenerative problem there is, from Alzheimer's to autism, carpal tunnel, ulnar tunnel, diabetic neuropathy, all of them, and COVID. It's inflammatory, caused by a simple food that could be eliminated from our diet, and Big Pharma would have no customers anymore. And that's the problem. So we can't get research dollars because, I'm going to tell you a shocking, I'll divulge it, I always say this in private, but Monsanto, who makes high fructose corn syrup, makes the herbicide Roundup, which is glyphosate, is used to make high fructose corn syrup. They are the major funders of the universities. Personal experience. I went there, I'm not going to name the university. I went there, the university, I have the answer. I lectured several times in the biochemistry and genetics department, and I used the word glyphosate. And I saw this kind of reaction by the professors. I said, we'll get back to you. They didn't get back to me because they knew I knew the answer. So I did not get the funding. Now, if I went in there and I said, sugar is the greatest thing since sliced bread, I would have got the funding because that would have supported the narrative. So if our universities in this country, and probably in Canada as well, are dominated by big pharma and big agriculture, of course we're all sick. Why would we not be sick? And COVID is just part of that equation. Fortunately, we have people like David here who has escaped the allopathic model, which is for every itis, there's a drug or a surgery. That's how I was trained. That's how he was trained. But obviously, this day now, new information, and stem cells in particular, can solve all these problems. So that brings us another subject. Why are stem cells not readily available in the United States? You have to go to Panama or China or Mexico. They work. They work on any inflammatory disease without side effects. We can't do some of those things here in the United States, and certainly not in Canada, because I talked to the FDA people up there, and they're like, oh no, this is bad stuff. I'll tell you an interesting story. John McCain, anybody remember him? Yeah. So John McCain convened a Senate hearing for the science and technology in 2003. He invited 17 really good scientists there, one of which was Joanne Kurtzberg. Joanne is an investigator for stem cells at Duke University. And I heard her speak in Utah about 4 years ago. And she showed kids who could not speak from autism, and I say the juice, gave those kids stem cells, and they could speak. Jerry's kids, muscular dystrophy, who were on crutches, gave them stem cells, and they were walking. I saw it on film. Dr. Parker was with me. She showed gene arrays, which is showing the genes before and the genes afterwards. And I said to her, I said, Dr. Kurtzberg, so you're really saying this is not a genetic disease, because a genetic disease would be immutable, unchangeable. But she changed it. So you have to have a trigger, and that's called epigenetics. If you carry the gene, you come in contact with the trigger, you will get the disease. We have a couple of NFL players here. He looks like the guy on that Netflix, Elliot. Yes, you do. Every time I look at you. Yes. Yeah. So let's take ALS. 400% higher prevalence in the NFL. Do NFL players eat a lot of carbohydrates? They have to get to that weight. Do they have trauma? Do you think maybe? That nerve, let's define that word. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. A in Latin means no muscle function on either side of the neck. The specific nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve, which allows you to swallow. If you can't swallow, the fluid goes in your lungs and you die. And it takes about 15 months. And there's no way out of that. So, trauma, my theory is trauma plus sugar equals nerve dysfunction. It doesn't matter which nerve it is, because carpal tunnel, the median nerve, muscle function. Muscle function. Even autism, same thing, different nerve. Hypoglossal nerve innervates the tongue. Function for speech, for grasping. It's all the same thing. But back to the NFL, they have the money to do the research for their players, but all the research money goes to find another drug to treat the effect of what sugar is causing. We need to get to the cause. Now, everybody loves sugar. I mean, it tastes great, but it's addicting. It's worse than cocaine, and we're all addicted, everybody. But it's causing severe diseases. We need to know the truth. So, Elliot, charging you would get this message to the NFL.
I'm going to move it to Ephraim. He's played 13 years in the league. He's a top player. He's in the NFL. I played only a couple of years, and he's a writer, a big writer for the movie or the TV industry. But I was blessed to play golf today with around Willie Galt. He's a friend of mine from the NFL. I played with the Chicago Bears. And we talk amongst each other. I'm going to give him a call. Antonio Gates is here. Of course, he's at another function right now because he's doing a lot of these guys doing paid events over the weekend. But he will be in touch. And he's still working for San Diego right now. Well, actually LA right now because they moved to LA. So these guys, the Willie Galts, and many of the older guys that are feeling these effects as a result of sugar, because we know that that I understand what you're saying, but my question would be, and I'll be quick because of course I've got to get into the airport, but once the stem cells are done, which helps to modify or convert or better the genetic damage that's been caused by sugar.
Correct.
When that happens, is it correct that a person's now they still have to, they can't do the same thing they used to do. They can't continue eating sugar because it'll happen to them again.
Absolutely. Here's a stunning story on autism. Dr. Parker and myself were in Panama at Dr. Reardon's clinic. They treat a lot of autistic kids and MS as well. So we were in the cafeteria. It's a huge operation. And I was watching the kids because they eat, I hate to say it, they eat like dogs. They look left to right and they're just eating with their hands because they can't get enough sugar. And the moms are kind of doting to them because they're guilty of this problem as if they caused it, but they're co-contributors. So I was looking at this one kid and I said to the mom, I said, this your first time to Panama? She said, no, this is my third time. I said, why would you come back? Does it work? And she said, yes. I said, well, tell me about that. Well, the kid couldn't speak. He was about 12 years old. Spends a week in Panama with Dr. Reardon, IV, and then he can speak. And I don't know why I said this. I said, what did he say? And he said, I want a donut. And I said, well, that's what he's craving. Why are you giving that to him? And she got really annoyed with me because I'm the messenger, and she was obviously wealthy and could afford that, and said, I'll give my kid whatever he wants. I said, but really, you're giving him the poison. So that message of don't eat the sugar, even in stem cell clinics, they don't really talk about it. Just come back when you need another fix. Well, that's just another drug. So to your point, yes.
Is it the sugar that's the problem? Because a lot of NFL players or college football players they starch up on taro root or rooty plants, potatoes, and all that other else, and that's where you get a lot of the lineman bulk. And so, is it the sugar that's processed, or can we still eat potatoes and taro root and all those types of things so we can still bulk up and have some of that calorie meat that's not just pure protein?
Right. So that's an excellent question. So everybody used to think, and myself included, when I was in school, calorie is a calorie is a calorie. It's not true. So the carbohydrates, the complex carbohydrates, they break down to a simple sugar, glucose. The human genome cannot tolerate more than 4 grams of glucose at any one time. So insulin has to spike. Now that's why you bulk up, because insulin is the only molecule, hormone, that can add fat to your body. So if you eat a lot of sugar, it will convert to fat, and that's the bulk. But Dr. Parker, my training is different than most other doctors because we train with Dr. Dellon down at Johns Hopkins, and he taught us all of this biochemistry of the sugar and effect on nerves. So there's three processes. The polyol pathway, which means sugar inside the nerve, makes it swell. Sugar plus a protein, it's called the Maillard reaction, makes the tunnel that the neurovascular bundle goes through shrink, and that's called compression. What I did was prove that asymmetric dimethylarginine cut off the blood supply to the nerve. So that molecule of asymmetric dimethylarginine, it sounds complicated, but let me see if I can break it down. So asymmetric means that the two methyl groups are on one side of the arginine. That's all it means. And it just blocks the pathway. So, but there's another pathway that feeds into this nitric oxide pathway, and that's called tetrahydrobiopterin. It's a long word. We'll call it BH4. That is composed of B6, B12, folic acid, and good old vitamin C. Now this is where it kind of gets a little spooky because human beings cannot produce their own vitamin C. There was a genetic, they say random, intervention about 220,000 years ago on chromosome 2. So we can't do that. So glucose has an enzyme to make vitamin C. We cannot do it. We have the enzyme in our genome, but it's not working. I find that extraordinarily unusual because everybody else can do that. We have to get vitamin C. So to knock at the cell wall, 2 molecules show up, vitamin C and glucose. Insulin will let glucose into the cell, not vitamin C. And we have to have vitamin C to convert L-arginine to nitric oxide. If we don't, our O2 levels go down. A virus such as COVID, SARS virus, they're smart people too. Let's talk about a virus. What is a virus? It's just a speck of DNA or RNA. They can't duplicate, but they need a live cell, and they need sugar. So if you're diabetic or pre-diabetic or metabolic syndrome, they're going to get into your cell looking for food. On that spike protein, I can show you paper after paper. They're called glycans. They're attached to that spike protein. That's their food. So they get in your cell, yum, yum, here's the glycan. They get in your cell and say, may I use your copy machine to make copies of the RNA, which we know is the cytokine storm, because the white cells think there's a fight going on inside the cell, which there is, and they come in and they get wiped out, and your O2 level goes down, you can't produce oxygen, and you die. It's that simple. So here's another question I ask. Who is the Surgeon General of the United States? Anybody know? I didn't either. So we had, in World War II, who was our number one general? Wasn't it General Patton? I think everybody knew that, and they made a movie at it. But here we have a pandemic, and no one knows who the general in charge is. But we know a guy by the name of Fauci, don't we? Yeah, he's a lieutenant. He's a lieutenant running the army. Something is wrong here. Very wrong. So
who's the general?
Well, that's a good question. Who is the general? We don't know. They keep changing the Surgeon General. So the one during the COVID, his name was Murthy. Had a nice uniform there, was a very naval-looking, handsome guy, but never heard from him.
Yeah, and it's a little bit different in Canada, and it's the health authorities are provincial, or I guess state is the other way of saying it. And there is someone at the federal level as well. During COVID, her name was Tan. But for me, I mean, I'm boots on the ground. I'm the guy really trying to do the best for you when resources that are being thrown at you are the wrong ones. And that's why I sort of developed my own philosophy. But you know, in my opinion, the real pandemic here was the fact that bodies are hijacked by the system, and you're running your body on the insulinogenic system, and that's what creates the inflammatory processes that were, gone awry by this virus and the spike protein. And the other real pandemic worldwide was the vitamin D deficiency that everybody has. And they understood this and were able to use this to advantage. Why is vitamin D so low? Because of the hijacking of bodies. And, not through anybody's fault, right? It's just imprinting as a child or whatever else. That produces the bulking up. And when there's a lot of fat, vitamin D doesn't work very well. Vitamin D is the other thing you can't produce as a human being. Dogs can, but you can't. That's what I think the message should have happened. When I was a kid in Canada, you're talking about Canada and US differences, there was a big program when I was a kid called Participaction. We noticed in the 1970s and 1980s that BMI, weight of adults, was increasing. And so they had a national campaign, and with these contests for the kids, and you can win these badges, and it was all about trying to help you with empowering your own body. And I just didn't quite understand why, when this happened, there wasn't a national campaign on vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, and trusting that you can do this yourself.
Probably because there is no money in that sentence. None. So another question is, back to the John McCain symposium on stem cells in 2003, still we need more research. Yet with the vaccine, there was no research. That's a question that has to be asked at a high level. And so my new book is it's called Unglued. So I'm looking for all the mechanisms that we can do. I was at a think tank in California, Hollywood, and they asked me, so what does the word mean? Glucose. I said, well, it's a simple sugar. He said, no, what does the word mean? I didn't know. So we looked it up. Glucose means, it is a Greek word, again, means to adhere, to stick, sticky. It's glue. That's why it's called glucose. That's why the book is called Unglued, How to Eliminate Sugar Out of Your Diet. But if you're 65 and you've already been glued, how can you break those bonds of the glue? In my opinion, number one is stem cell. And it works very, very well. Change your diet, of course. Vitamins, supplements. Light-emitting diodes is a very good technique because it increases nitric oxide by red lights, which is amazing. It used to be just lasers. When I was writing my first book, we had lasers that did use, that worked to raise your nitric oxide. Now, light-emitting diodes can do it at a very low price. So supplements, change your diet, LED, and you're going to be well. Yes?
Sorry. A few questions I know, but a lot of people like to enjoy a beef product that is very popular called Wagyu beef, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Wagyu beef is heavy in marbling, and it's not a grass-fed beef, and to get some of that marbling, would you, but yet when you eat a non-carbo diet, fat and protein is great for you. Would you recommend a Wagyu beef or not, or too much of it is a bad thing?
Well, Wagyu, there is an American version of Wagyu, and they do have them grass-fed, but it's not as marbled as a corn-fed, because that's what you want is all that fat, but it's not the good fat. You want good fat, which is omega-3, which is made from grass. Chickens are the same way. The chickens in the United States are fed corn. Everything is fed corn. So everybody's sick. Well, you notice the viruses that sweep through the chicken industry. That's why. The bee population, this is another crazy story. It has to do with 5G. So when I wrote my first book, there was a fellow by the name of Martin Paul. He has a PhD in chemistry, professor emeritus at Washington State University. So his theory is that if a nerve will discharge 7 million times the calcium ions out of the nerve with 5G. 7 million times. So everybody, and we're all kind of sloppy on this, should have Faraday cages around our phones, and we should have lots of things to counteract electromagnetic fields. So if I'm right, electromagnetic field is a trauma plus sugar equals nerve dysfunction. And that's why we have the prevalence of glioblastomas, but that's a whole other discussion. Yes?
Are you familiar with the book, The China Study, by a PhD, Dr. Colin
Yes.
Campbell?
Yeah, and I talked to him when I was writing. In mainland China, they had incidents of cancer progressing. He was called in to look at that, and he felt that the protein in milk products was the problem. I think it can be a problem if the cow is eating corn, not because milk is bad, milk is produced by corn is bad. So he based his whole theory on that. So he's into a vegetarian diet. There's another really interesting story from an Australian doctor. He's a neurosurgeon talking about vegetables are out to kill you. And he's into the carnivore diet, and he's actually right. All vegetables have a poison in them, and he explains it this way. Animals can move away from danger. Plants can't. So they have like cactus. They have thorns, rose bushes, thorns, poison ivy. Well, you'll get a rash. But Brussels sprouts and kale and things that we think are safe are not. They cause irritable bowel, cause disruption of your intestinal tract. Those proteins leak into your system, and they're really not good for you. They're really, human beings are carnivores. I discussed this with Don Johansson, who happens to be here, and he invited me to a lecture in New York City years ago. What did Lucy eat? If you believe Lucy is the first primate. She was a arboreal being, and when she got out of the trees, then she ate bugs, then fat, meat, cooking meat, and here we are. Took 3.2 million years. So I'm not sure that theory is correct. I think there's been genetic modifications along the way, and some are sinister. That's my new book, Original Sin, Hacking the Human Genome. Yeah.
Is there a good nitric oxide supplement?
Yes. So the beets are good. So you want to get lots of L-arginine, but when you take L-arginine, you got to be careful. You need that coenzyme, B6, B12, folic acid. I would add in benfotiamine, which is a B1, and certainly lots of vitamin C. You should do that. Yes. Yes.
One of the things that I'm concerned about is we have 70% more sugar inside of our diets because of the beet industry. We have genetic modification, we've got MSGs, we've got GMO, I mean, we've got all these things inside of our environment. Is it just the sugar, or should we be concerned about sugar, glyphosates, all the other poisons and toxins?
Yes. So Stephanie Seneff, top scientist at MIT, she helped me understand the sugarmate pathway. I'm not sure, we never had that in school. But let me see if I can make it simple. She's got like 3 PhDs. She wrote me a letter when I was on my way to Costa Rica. I'll never forget it. I think every other word I didn't know. Okay, and it was a long letter. So I had to get a dictionary and try to figure out what she's saying. She's a physicist and a biologist. Here's how she explains it. When Monsanto got permission from the FDA through their studies that glyphosate did not affect human beings, and it didn't directly, but it did affect your microbiome, which is the bacteria. So glyphosate, as the word says, the GL portion is glycine. So they took lysine and attached a phosphate to it and stuck it in the genome. So when a plant is sprayed with glyphosate, everything dies except for the genetically altered corn product or soy product. So it doesn't get affected, everything else does. However, when you eat that product, it has glyphosate on it, and it gets into your microbiome. And this is the experiment that I wanted to do, which I didn't get a grant for. So there are about 1,000 organisms in your gut. So I proposed that let's see which of those organisms love glyphosate, and we can eliminate them. And I could tell by putting sensors on a sensory nerve or a motor nerve and see if the amplitude went down with certain bacteria and they went up with others. So I would want the good ones and not the bad ones. That's when I got, really? Yeah. Because what I said was correct, but I didn't get the grant. And the person in the audience, like this, I didn't know it, is the director of Monsanto and raised $300 million for the institution I was at. Of course I didn't. I did a deep dive on him. He's a virologist by training. Started as a veterinarian out of London, part of this Davos group, the World Economic Order. He's on that as well. And his good buddy is Fauci. What a coincidence, yes.
Did you know that the president and CEO of Pfizer, Adam Borla, is also a veterinarian, trained in the study of fertilization of sheep? Let that sink in.
Oh,
That's our person that was
Oh my gosh.
telling everybody they needed to be vaccinated.
Correct. And our past surgeon or head of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, is on the board.
Yes.
I call him a clairvoyant because 3 years prior to getting on the board of Pfizer, he just knew he would land there.
Oh, also, Doctor, you also know about Veritas and the undercover camera study
Oh, yeah,
they did
that's-
about
yeah.
the vaccinations and so forth, but they were bragging about how they have people from different pharmaceutical companies doing, basically it's an open revolving door from government officials doing
Yes.
oversight to go to pharmaceutical companies and back again, so that the overseers are the ones working for the pharmaceutical companies and have a place to land.
It's almost 100%. Yeah. So the fix is in. People like us who are trying to get the message out, and that's what we have to do. But we're putting ourselves at extreme risk in all the countries because they run the country, and that is the deep state. Yes?
I was writing a book series back in 1993 with an applied kinesiologist named Carolyn Finch, and we went very heavily into sugar. We went heavily into all the aluminum in the foods, everything else that's causing the cancers, causing this and that. The medical world would not let us put the book out, by the way, in 1993, because it would have saved, 15 more years of women not getting breast cancer because they're not, putting the underarm and get clogs up in their bra, and that gives them blah blah blah. But they don't want to help us. I mean, obviously they don't want to help us. Sure. And I thank you for everything that you are doing to help us, Doctor, very much. The only one thing I might just suggest, Dr. Richard Leakey is, you all know him, I'm sure. Was a paleontologist and all that, and he was behind gave a lot of the support to Darwin, saying that we came from Lucy, as you said. On his deathbed, because he was so upset that he had lied and put false things together to make it look like we came from monkeys and Lucy, he wrote a book called, Origins Rediscovered, or Reevaluated, or whatever. I suggest you read it just because I think you'd like it if you're gonna, just...
Yeah, so I know people who knew Leakey, who were on that expedition, Don Johansson. They never identified that link. So there's an excellent book by Aaron Filler. It's kind of a long story, but I'll tell you a story. It's just to your point. So Aaron was a PhD student at Harvard under Stephen Jay Gould. And he was given a fossil. This is kind of like a Don Brown mystery novel. And they didn't know what it was. They sent him to Cambridge, and they used a 6 Tesla magnet. I didn't even know they made those, but they apparently did. And Aaron wrote his PhD dissertation on the upright ape, to your point. And I read his PhD dissertation because I was on my way to Egypt, long story. And I read it and I thought, the book is called The Upright Ape. You would love that book. And so I read the book and I called Dr. Filler, and now he's a neurosurgeon. So he's PhD, anthropology, because he knows the lumbar spine. He goes to medical school, becomes a neurosurgeon. He just became an attorney as well. He practiced in Santa Monica, and he also developed what's called MR neurography, and that's my field that I'm interested in. Can we see these compressions in nerves? Yes, you can. So Dr. Dellen's theory, that's his theory, that in diabetic neuropathy is a compression, and you can see it on an MRI neurography. Anyway, long story short, I invited him to a seminar that we put on about, I think it was 2015. And he gave the lecture for all the nerve surgeons, but my interest was really in what you were talking about, and you got to read this book.
I will, and I'm sorry if I misheard before, sometimes I don't hear while I was hearing you speaking about Lucy a little bit. I just wasn't sure for a minute. It sounded like you were making a connection between, I was like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the narrative, that Lucy is our first primate. I gave I thought the best interview I was given by Dr. Wendy Muhammad, and she is with the Nation of Islam. It was an hour lecture, or I shouldn't say interview. She was absolutely phenomenal, and she is in the vascular world. And I don't know if you know Louis Farrakhan, and he's considered anti-Semitic and anti-everything. But his feeling is that we were genetically modified as a race. Very interesting theory. Well, Dr. Filler thinks that as well, and so does Zachariah Sitchin, if you ever read his books. And now Graham Hancock and Greg Braden, we were. And it's a very interesting story. So we are probably human 3.5 by now, and we're evolving by that process, stem cells. So, end it with this, I'll just give you some, this offends everybody. So in Genesis, creation, Adam was, God made Eve out of Adam's rib, correct? Does everybody agree with that? I mean, that's what it says.
I agree. We agree that it says that.
Yes.
I don't agree.
But the interpretation, what's inside a rib? Bone marrow. What's inside a bone marrow? Stem cells. That's how she was made. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.